Thanks, Tom. Hi, folks. As Tom said, thanks very much for coming. It's great to see so many of you here. We're going to have a 45-minute talk, and then afterwards I'll open the floor for questions. Today I'm talking about the science of self-belief. I have a friend, well actually, he's a friend of a friend, and he's a professional gambler. He has a side hustle which combines his hobby with his interest in making money through gambling. And he once told me that he goes to professional tennis matches, and during the match he watches for the moment when the player decides to win or lose the match. Then he quickly puts a bet on the player, because he maintains that often that moment happens before that decision is replicated on the scoreboard. It's a good theory. It obviously works. He makes money at it. He enjoys doing it. And while I agree with his hypothesis, I don't believe that people actually decide to win or to lose. But what I do believe is the individuals that he's watching are professional tennis players. So they have a history of playing a lot of tennis. They understand how things are likely to progress and to turn out. And based on that, they're likely to select, or they're likely to embrace a strategy which matches what they perceive is actually happening. The reason why I have this belief is because I am a human fear specialist. A strange occupation which normally ends conversations down at the schoolyard gate. Hi, Sean, what do you do? Oh, I'm a human fear specialist. Oh, what do you do? Oh, well, I have a lab and I bring people in and I give them electric shocks and I make them scared, and then I see how scared they get. As a job, it's kind of odd, but it's important that we do this. Now, obviously, this isn't my lab, but if I ever won the lotto, that's what my lab would look like. Because within my lab, I have a number of different processes and machines which measure people's level of fear. Now, if you wanted to see what fear looked like, this is what it looks like. This is someone who's been given an electric shock, and then this is how they reacted to it. This is a screen grab from real time on a polygraph. So I measure your level of arousal using a polygraph stroke lie detector. The reason why I use fear is because fear is a very reliable manufacturer of electric shock is because electric shock is a very reliable manufacturer of fear. It's easy to generate, it's easy to apply. Now, what I need people to understand is, because often this gets lost in the translation, the electric shock that I apply is a small stimulation to the forearm of the individual. It's delivered under clinical conditions with high level of ethical adherence and responsibility. So it's not, the aim is not to give people pain, the aim is to make them scared. So in a typical experiment, it's normally in 3 phases. So the first phase is making people aware of the relationship between a word which appears on the screen, which in this case is the word ill, and then when ill appears, after 1.5 seconds, you get a shock. When another word appears on the screen, weep, it's not followed by a shock. So very quickly people learn that the word ill is paired with a shock. What happens is that people stop fearing the shock, they start to fear the word, and that's just basic classical conditioning. Now, I give people the opportunity to avoid then in the second phase, because I'm interested in the behaviours that fear generates. So when ill appears, if they press the space bar or a button, it cancels out the shock in 100% of the time. When weep appears, if they press the button, nothing happens. And the reason why I do that is because what I want to do is to get them to avoid receiving the shock. Because when they avoid receiving the shock, I can then measure what other words that they would perhaps be afraid of. And in this case, I'm kind of sneaky because the word I introduce is sick. Now, sick is a different word to ill, but it kind of means the same. But it sounds different, it's spelled different, it looks different. So only by understanding the relationship between ill and sick would people be likely to generalize the fear that they've learned to ill to another one. And then what we find is that people obviously, 99% of people obviously try to avoid the bad word. okay? But what we also found was that 65 or 68% of people also avoided the synonym of the word. Now, that had never been trained. This was, to put it into my friends' parlance, they had decided that this is what they wanted to do. But actually what happened was their experience from learning that ill was a bad word and likely to be paired with a shock, they extended that into also the word sick, but they didn't do it for weep or cry. Now, I compare these behaviours across a range of other factors. So I've examined it in relation to worry, I've examined it in relation to anxiety, intelligence, gender, age, personality traits across multi-dimensions. And the problem is I've never found why 65% of people avoid the synonym and why 35% don't, because there's no correlations which are robust enough which can support that these type of people will generalize, these type of people won't. All I could come up with after 7 experiments and 5-6 years was that the people who generalize, they generalize because they want to generalize, or they like to generalize. For people who don't, it's because they don't, but there's no other factors which kind of correspond with that. So I wasn't left with any degree of certainty regarding that these type of people are likely to take their experience and transfer it onto new experiences and behave in a way which was avoiding what they thought was a fear. My favorite bit of the experiments is that when you did a debriefing afterwards, was that everybody told me the same thing. When I said, well, how did you get on? They said, well, I did what I was supposed to do. I got them right. And I'm like, well, what's right? And they said, well, whenever that new word came up, whenever weep came up, or when sick came up, I just avoided it because I knew I'd get a shock. But the people the 35% who didn't, what they said to me was, oh yeah, I got it right, Sean. Whenever the word weep came up, I didn't avoid, I just waited and see what was happening, and sure I was right. Now, the thing about it is, both of those groups, 65% of people, 35% of people, had exactly the same experience. And they also both thought that they were correct in their experience, that they'd picked the right way to do it. But there's no difference between the groups. It's just some did and some didn't. 2/3 did avoid and 1/3 didn't avoid. And if we bring it back to my friend, the gambler, it means that the tennis players who decide, as he said, now they decide to win or lose, it's likely that at the end of the game, they will have decided that it was the right strategy to do, that they were going to lose that game. But the ones who didn't, and then they won, they obviously reckon that they took the right course of action. But they will never find out the opposite because they don't experience it. Now, I don't agree that they choose it, because this evidence shows that when you teach people that this is likely to happen, then what they do with that information is likely to promote behavior. So rather than being an actual decision, as a behavioral scientist, I will promote that it's your experience and what you've done which is likely to promote how you perform and how many risks you take and whether you choose to engage or whether you choose to avoid in the future. Because I couldn't split the two groups, I came up with an experiment which is a bit more devious. What I did was I made it really hard for people to avoid getting a shock. So what I did was that you have to press the button 20 times in 5 seconds, because my rationale was that people who were motivated to avoid would be much more motivated to just pound the keyboard and to avoid getting a shock. And indeed, that's what I found. During phase 2, whenever I introduced the avoidance shock, so everybody, 100% of people tried to avoid or experience the shock. Second phase, when I introduced avoidance, what I found was that 98% of people tried to avoid. There's one that didn't, don't know why. Of those 50 people, 37 successfully avoided getting a shock. So there's 37 of those people were beating the keyboard to death to make sure that they didn't get a shock. However, 13 didn't. And those figures kind of add up to what we'd already seen. One third of people, everybody will try and avoid, but some are more successful than others. So what I had is two groups. 37% of people weren't getting a shock. Now, they weren't getting a shock across 12 times. However, 13 people were constantly getting a shock. Now, once again, once I split them into the group, because everybody literally, a high percentage, over 50%, wanted to avoid the word which was similar to the bad word. When I split them into groups of who had successfully avoided and who hadn't, I was hoping that that would correlate then with levels of anxiety, levels of fear, levels of risk-taking, levels of acceptance of their fate, all of these things. But once again, I couldn't find a correlation between the two behaviours. What I did find, though, kind of knocked me for six, and it took me about 18 months of bringing it to conference, trying to figure out what happened. So on the right-hand side, what we have is the actual level of arousal that people were experiencing. And as you can see, when everybody's getting a shock in phase one, the people who successfully avoided and the people who didn't successfully avoid getting a shock, they both experienced the same high level of arousal. However, when we move into phase two, which is where you're allowed to avoid, what I found was that the people who were successfully avoiding a shock, they relaxed. But I also found that the people who weren't successfully avoiding, i.e. were still getting shocked, were equally as relaxed. And that just doesn't make sense. Why are people who are getting 12 shocks one after the other, why are they as relaxed as people who aren't? My initial theory was that there's a concept called learned helplessness, where when we feel we don't have control, we actually just recede. And it comes from animal studies, because that's what animals do. When animals cannot figure out what is going on, but they're still being punished, they tend to just give up. So I examined learned helplessness, and the way I did it was, I went back through everybody's data, and I measured how many times they hit the button when they were trying to avoid. And what I discovered was there is two massive differences between the groups. These are the people who are getting shocked. These are the people who aren't getting shocked. And simply put, the people who are avoiding the shock were more motivated than the people who weren't, because they started at a higher number. Because the instruction was, if you don't want to receive a shock, you will need to press the button, but you may need to press the button a number of times. So the people who started at a higher level, they were more successful. The people who started at a lower level, they weren't successful, because you can see it's quite clear cut. But to add to the conundrum of why they were relaxed, whenever I went into trial by trial and person by person, I discovered this, that the people who were getting the shock, they weren't helpless, but they also weren't trying any harder. So the people who were not getting a shock, they maintained the number of presses. So if they hit it 21 times, they kept hitting it 21 times, because it was successful. So we understand that, because behaviour is rewarded, so you're likely to keep going. The weird thing is that the people who were getting a shock, they still persisted with the behaviour. So the people who were hitting the spacebar 9 times by trial number 6, by trial number 10, they were still hitting it 9 times, even though they know it wasn't going to be successful. But the weird thing was, the people who were hitting it 19 times, you're like, oh my God, you were like just one away from it and you would have cancelled it. They didn't reduce how many times they hit it. They hit it 19 times, 10 times in a row, which doesn't make any sense. But it makes sense whenever I think about those tennis players. And this goes back to what I was saying, that when you select a strategy, or when you engage with a strategy, it's likely to be supported throughout. So my friend is right. The decision, or the decision to not win that match is not likely to be obvious to a lot of people until it starts appearing on the scoreboard, because the people are likely to keep performing in the way that they have been, but they don't have any optimism and they don't have any drive to do any better. So they just maintain that performance. So the other thing about it is that it also makes it very hard to measure fear-related behaviour, because once we select a strategy, it's based on what we've learned before, but how we engage that strategy in new situations is simply idiosyncratic. It's down to what we do. And all of my experiments like 7 years, a lot of experiments, a lot of participants. I've never been able to separate them, and it kind of makes sense. Why now? Because it's idiosyncratic. So I bought it, and then I took it home and I read it. And halfway through the second chapter, I read, anxiety, it stops you from doing new stuff. And I went, yeah, that's exactly what my research shows. That once you generate enough anxiety, people stop behaving in the way that they would like to. They just literally start looking for either a fight or flight response. But in his book, Ian Robertson goes on to explain why he thinks that he can explain it. Now, he is biased because Ian Robertson is a neuroscientist. He likes things that happen in the brain. I'm a behavioral scientist. I like things that happen outside of the brain. But his theory is that confidence is the call to action which is promoted by our self-esteem and our optimism. Now, the self-esteem is historical, so our experiences in the past contribute to how we feel about ourselves. Optimism is a future-focused perception, and confidence contributes to optimism because it's based on our previous experiences. So he maintains that, he calls them sisters, that self-esteem and optimism promote a call. I've measured optimism in all my experiments, but I've never interacted the two of them to see what the resulting behavior works. And Robertson's rationale is simply this, that when you have self-belief, he calls self-belief and self-confidence, he interchanges them, so excuse me if I do the same. He says when we have self-belief, we set goals. When we set ourselves goals towards a target, we anticipate success. Anticipating success, he's a neuroscientist, remember, anticipating success does a weird thing in the brain. When you anticipate success in the brain, your brain thinks you're already successful, so it releases dopamine. Now, it releases dopamine because it's rewarding you for what it anticipates, what it thinks is your success. The example I always get is that when you say, God, I'm going to get a Ferrari, your brain goes, woohoo, we have a Ferrari. But then it goes, oh, I can't afford a Ferrari. The brain goes, where's the Ferrari? But we get the burst of it, right? So what happens when you release dopamine is that it increases your motivation. It also takes away any anxiety that's there. But importantly, what it also does, it increases your attention and focus. Because you've now got goals that you want to satisfy, you've anticipated rewards, and it's promoting you to try harder. Then you can take action because now you're primed for action and you give yourself the opportunity for success. Now the opposite, Robertson maintains the opposite of self-belief is anxiety, because with anxiety, different behaviors happen. Okay, he claims that you go into a deliberative mindset. When you go into a deliberative mindset, you weigh the pros and the cons. So you've moved away from setting goals to what would happen if I did this? What's the good things? What's the bad things? The problem when you combine anxiety with deliberation is that it just expects bad stuff to happen. You come from an optimistic perspective to a pessimistic perspective. And you expect this punishment. You are aware of punishments that could happen. So it restricts your actions. But worse than that, your brain now thinks that you're under threat because you've thought of all these negative things. So rather than the Ferrari, it just goes, we're going to get killed here. So it activates the parasympathetic system. Now, when you do that, adrenaline increases, blood pressure, heart rate, but you get an increased focus, but it's the other focus because now your brain is frantically going, what did I miss? What did I miss? There's something here that's going to kill us. What did I miss? So rather than focusing on the task, you're now focusing on other threats that may be there. Now you're so busy focusing on other possible threats and other disadvantages and other negative affects that it's likely that you might become sufficiently distracted that you never start. So Robinson is right. Anxiety does stop you from doing new stuff. Who else has this level of super confidence? Well, it turns out all successful people have it, because if we go back to what Professor Robinson said, once we have a high level of self-esteem and a high level of optimism, it's likely that we have confidence. So successful people have that self-esteem because they've obviously won more than they've lost. Rich people have it. Rich people, contrary to what you believe or what you've been led to believe, money does make you happier. It makes you 10 to 20% happier. If you ignore what the Daily Mail says, lottery winners are much happier than non-lottery winners. Okay? However, the beauty about it is, and it comes back to beliefs, the beauty about it is that it's not only is it how much money you have, but it's also how rich you believe you are. So it depends who you compare yourself to. Because rich people don't have to be rich, they just have to be richer than whoever they're comparing themselves to. And I forget who said it, but a famous psychologist once said that a rich man is someone who earns $100 more than his wife's sister's husband. That's a rich man. So I'm assuming it was the 50s or 60s. Okay? So, rich people have it. Optimists have it. Optimists, entrepreneurs, serial optimists, they're always working on the basis that this is going to work out. By being an optimist, you're likely to be more resilient. You're also likely to disregard evidence to the contrary. Now, the caveat is it does make you seek out risk rather than just appreciate it. People with hot hands, it used to be thought to be a fallacy, but making shots over and over again means that the likelihood of you scoring the next one increases significantly. People who overcome challenges, so anyone who's been through severe trauma, they tend to be a lot more confident post-trauma, particularly in similar situations, because their experience has contributed to an increase in self-esteem. It also didn't kill them, which makes them slightly more optimistic. And finally, anyone who has a perception of control, my participants in that experiment where you have to press 20 times, despite the fact that they were getting a shock, the best answer I came up with was that while they were still getting a shock, they knew what was going to happen if they kept doing what I do. So it removed uncertainty, it removed anxiety, and the fact that they continuously pressed that button the same amount of times means they were operating with a focus. But as you saw from the anxiety levels, it was a much reduced level of anxiety than they experienced before that and also after that, because when we brought in the new word, their anxiety levels went up, but the people who were successfully avoiding, it remained the same. So who else has it? Well, we do. We all do. Developmental psychologists believe that we have this bias. We have a bias, inherent bias towards optimism. It could be argued that the reason we have it is because if we didn't, we wouldn't have left the cave. We would have just remained within our own field. So we're born with it. However, an interesting study showed that while boys and girls are similar in the early years of their lives, girls experience a 30% drop in confidence between the ages of 8 and 15, which is not comparative with boys. Boys experience 0. So while we all start the same, then it doesn't happen. It isn't maintained as we grow older. I love this quote by Weinstein. Weinstein says that rather than what Professor Robertson was saying, Weinstein says, look, self-confidence is just unrealistic optimism. We need it because it maintains our self-esteem. It reduces anxiety. But it is an unrealistic optimism, so it's not built on anything which is solid. Now, my argument as a behavioural scientist is it's built on our experience, but also how we then use that experience to deal with novel scenarios. And finally, in Professor Robinson's book, what he actually highlighted was that Devon and Schechter highlighted that optimists not only have a much more rosy view of what's going to happen in the future, but they also reorient their past to a much more rosy view. So their self-esteem is being built, because they're optimistic, not only are they giving themselves a better chance of being successful in the future, but they also reframe their experience to make it successful and help with it. So we have it. Now, the question is, if we all have it and people who are successful and rich, they have loads of it, well, can we be too confident? Because we all know people who are overconfident. Your mother may have pointed out that you might be a little bit too overconfident as well, right? But when we look at it, overconfidence promotes action. So when we're overconfident, we're more likely to take that risk. We're more likely to take the shot. While underconfidence, as Professor Robertson was highlighting, it means that we move into this deliberative mindset where it's like, what's the worst that can happen? What's the best that can happen? Oh, I'm still thinking about it. The person who's overconfident is taking the shot. Missed, taking another shot, missed, taking another shot, hit it, and went, yeah, see, I told you that was going to happen. Right? So success promotes confidence. One of the studies in his book shows that early overconfidence in children promotes educational ability later on in school years. Could it be because of just simply the risk-taking, the interest in learning, the social interaction? All of these things might have an effect. And finally, and importantly, we like people who are overconfident. We like our leaders to be confident. If your leader is not confident, you won't follow him. If your leader is confident, you are more likely to follow him, even if you know they're not. But it's just the perception that's there. Do I need to mention that US gentleman whose confidence took him pretty far? And then it was, even when people appreciated that he didn't have the ability to fulfill that, people still believed it. So we do like our leaders to be confident. And the only negative is that it promotes risk-taking. Now, I say the only negative, it's one of the main contributory causes to the last recession, and the recession before that, and the recession before that, was overconfidence by people who were involved in the financial markets. But there's a lot of pluses to be taken from it, and very little negatives. So what stops us from having confidence? If we have an inherent bias, if we're good at it, if we've gotten to this far and we maintain that we have a level of success, what gets in the way? Well, from a psychological point of view, anxiety, mental illness, they all have a major contributing factor on the level of self-confidence we report, but also our expectations for the future, how we perceive ourselves to be viewed by other people. In fact, your perception of your ability to affect upon your future is one of the diagnostic criteria of the DSM. All right. Imposter syndrome, imposter syndrome is massive at the minute. There are people running courses on how to get people through imposter syndrome. My take on imposter syndrome is if you are working within a growth mindset, if you feel that your skills are not sufficient for the task you're doing, it's likely that they aren't, but you've put yourself in this situation and then you are pushing on, which means that you have a growth mindset. I think it's a relic of a mindset where you are trying to optimize your level of success. Now, if it's imposter syndrome due to anxiety, well then that is just a relic of the anxiety. But for most people, it's likely to have a degree of imposter syndrome about what you do because you're pushing yourself outside of your boundaries. So it's likely that that's what's going to contribute to it. Criticism kills self-confidence, kills it stone dead. As educators, we have to be very aware that when it comes to providing feedback to students or guidance to students, we have to be very aware that we provide them with advice rather than criticism. I always remind students, when you give me an essay and I correct it, I'm giving you a critique. It's not a criticism. It's designed for you to take that, implement it, and get better. But because criticism kills it stone dead. And then finally, as we've already highlighted, if we think we're going to get punished, then our confidence goes down. What also stops us from having it, and this is why the book blew my mind. It's this one study that I found in it. And I read it and I said, I think my post was, buy this book for your sister, your daughter, your auntie, your mother, your wife, whoever it is. Because in this one study, Dar Nimrod and Hein, in a college, got together 88 women. And under the guise that they were completing a maths test and an English comprehension test, they give them a test, and then they give them one of 4 different documents to read. The first document claimed that there was no specific gender differences in maths. Men and women were as good at maths as each other. The second one was that there were specific differences in maths, but they were due to experience. So the more experience you had with maths, the better you were at it. The third one was that it highlighted actual gender differences, but never mentioned maths. It just said that men performed different than women in a variety of different contexts. And finally, it said that gender-specific differences in maths was due to genetics. So men were genetically superior to women when it came to maths. Right? Then they give them a second maths test and they compared the results to it. I read this and I went, oh my God, because this, whatever about your self-belief, your promoted belief is something that you don't have control over. So, no specific gender difference in maths, scored 15 on average. Gender-specific differences in maths due to experience, scored 17 on average. Those who read the paper which highlighted general gender differences overall, but not specifically in maths, 7.5. But the paper that promoted that it was due to genetics that men were better than women, 6. So the people who got who were in the fourth group, performed less than 50% as well as those who just had no specific gender differences. But when they compared the tests from 1 to 2, the people in groups 3 and 4 actually disimproved just from reading that one paper. So the promoted beliefs have this, they have a strong effect on what your performance is likely to be. Now, Professor Robertson says this. He just goes on, and I've just put up all the stats because it just blew my mind. Boys have a bias towards self-confidence and belief. Boys think they are naturally better. When it comes to racing girls in a foot race, boys are more likely to win against girls than vice versa. If a boy does lose, he's more likely to win the next time than that. Okay? Between the ages of 14, I already highlighted, girls show a 30% drop in confidence where boys show none. We have lots of evidence which shows that the stereotyping of abilities within STEM subjects is successful in reducing the uptake of the courses. Girls overestimate the performance ability of boys. Boys underestimate the performance ability of girls. Girls run slower racing boys. Boys who lose to a girl are more likely to win the next one. It's not just physical and technical tasks. Boys perform equally to girls until it becomes a competition, and then they overperform. Now, this is just gender. The effects of stereotyping is also known in relation to age differences, culture difference, racial differences, and has been promoted for 100 years. There's many races who live with this perspective for the last 100 years that they are less intelligent. There is a website currently which is a proper website which ranks countries in order of intelligence. It ranks some Nordic countries and some Asian countries in the top 10. It ranks some African countries in the bottom 160. However, when you look at it, it scores on an IQ test. It doesn't measure intelligence, it measures access to education. But it's promoted that it's measuring intelligence. But what we know is that when we understand what the stereotype is, we are likely that it's going to have a serious effect on what we do. Well, okay, but can we fake it? If we don't feel it, can we fake it? Research has shown that you can't fake it if you don't have it. But if you do have it, then you really should show it. So adopting a power pose is not going to make you any more confident unless you're already confident. Then it's going to make you as confident. If you don't have confidence and you adopt a slouch, though, it is going to increase your own perspective of how confident you are because you're not behaving in that manner. So it can't be faked, but it can be supported just by doing actions. And that brings it on to this. How do we get more? How do we get more of it? Like, how can we be like Tom? Right? So if you want to build your self-esteem, if we take the perspective that we're working on two constructs. We're working on self-esteem and optimism, and then the interaction between them is that call to action. So, don't believe the hype is the first one. Whatever information you get which tells you can or can't or should or wouldn't do something, question it, research it, find out if that's true. Even if you find one article which supports the opposite belief to it, at least it might have some effect on dampening the the interference that's going to be provided by the hype. I always advise people who are entrepreneurs, look, to get over the hard times, to get over the disappointments, build a success bank. Build a bank in your brain which is just full of when you were successful and how you were successful and how you got through it. Because then when you get similar circumstances or you get different circumstances, much like my generalization of fear, if you generalize success, it's likely to carry across. It doesn't have to be exact. It just has to bear some way for you to reframe it. Katie Milkman ran a study in the US, and she found that asking students who were underperforming, by asking them to give advice to other students, actually improves their performance by year end. Because the advice that we give to people, it tends to be quite optimistic. You'll be grand. You just need to do this. You just need to do this. Maybe break it down into smaller chunks. Maybe do this. What they found was that by giving the advice, people actually became more focused, more optimistic about their own perspective. But when you do, learn the difference between advice and criticism. There's a massive difference between advice and criticism. Advice will promote action. Criticism will ruin self-esteem. So if you're going to give someone advice, make sure it's advice. Make sure it's helpful. Work from the perspective that this should make their lives better. It shouldn't improve their output, it just should make their lives better. I like to use Oettinger's approach to goals. It's called a whoop. And it's transforming a wish into a plan. And what you do is you write down what you want. I really want a Ferrari. Brain goes, woo. Then you highlight the outcome of having it. So what would be the best Ferrari that you could have? Well, I can't afford 400 grand, but I can probably afford 50 if I get 2 more jobs and if I don't sleep. So then you highlight the obstacles. Well, what's getting in the way? Well, maybe my time frame's a bit optimistic, so I'll just do that. And then you make a plan. I'm going to get it over 5 years instead of 2 years. Then I get some sleep. Better than making one plan is make 2 plans. What we know from fear research is if we give people the opportunity to avoid, whether they use it or not, it actually results in a reduction in anxiety. So just giving people a way out at the start means that the plan that they have doesn't need to have the certainty of a win. So it reduces the pressure that's on it, keeps anxiety out of it. Having a plan B, your plan B should be, if it all goes wrong, this is what I do. If I don't get a Ferrari, I get a Fiesta. Okay? And finally, remember, they're not failures, they're challenges. I remember an interview once with the husband of someone who wasn't very well liked in the UK. And he was asked what it was like being married to this person. And he said, yeah, it can be tough during the challenging times. And I remember thinking, that's an interesting word for what sometimes your life must be like. Challenging. Because when it's challenging, it means that it's a call to action. If it's a disaster, there's nothing you can do. If it's a catastrophe, there's nothing you can do. But whenever it's a challenge, there is a plan. You can make a plan. And expect more. Just expect more. Expect success. Whenever you enact a plan, expect it. Get those chemicals working in the brain. Improve your focus. Self-expectancy pushes us on. If we think we can do it, and we tell ourselves we can do it. So rather than giving advice to other people, you're giving advice to yourself. I think, Sean, you'd be able to do this if you just did it this way. And then that promotes action, performance. What we know is that parental expectancy promotes academic achievement in children. Someone once told me, I haven't got a study to support it, but someone once told me that the greatest predictor of academic achievement in school is parental expectancy, and from a correlationary point of view, obviously. Similarly, teachers' expectancy correlates with subsequent exam performance. Now, research into that has demonstrated that it doesn't make them superhuman. It doesn't make them ridiculously clever. They don't suddenly become A students. But what it does is it at least provides a level for the student to perform to. So they do get better. Expect success. If you expect success, then you get those endorphins going. It promotes performance. It promotes action. It also promotes a growth mindset, because if you expect success, then you're more resilient when it doesn't happen. because it didn't work. But I say to people all the time, I'm a scientist. I'm wrong a lot. It's kind of my job. But if I extend 15 years in positive psychology, is that optimism can be learned. There are processes where you can learn to be more optimistic. And it's just that. It's simply viewing your experiences under the microscope of what you thought would happen, what were the causes of it, and what can we do in the future. It's just having that growth mindset. Because it's worth being optimistic. Because optimism increases levels of resilience. It also promotes you to take action, and it gives you that perception of control, and that's what we're to look at. That's what we were talking about in the experiment. Those people who had a perception of control, despite the fact that they were still getting electric shocks, they were more relaxed about it because they felt it was under their control. And it's just that, if it gets too much, I can kind of change it. And then there's a lot of research which shows that we should try to be more optimistic because optimists live longer. Optimists are healthier. Optimists are happier. Positive psychology has a trinity. It is that happiness, success, and optimism, are all interrelated. And by affecting upon one, you're likely to affect on the others. So remember what I said about richer people being happier. Richer people are happier, but they're also more optimistic. And they're richer because they're successful. Or they perceive themselves to be successful. So it's not rocket science. It's simply learn to be happier. Learn to be more optimistic. You're likely to result in being happier. So if we were to just put it into a plan of action, because I do like a good plan. Okay, first of all, somebody asked me yesterday, what's your talk about in 3 words? And without even thinking, I went, confidence is cumulative. The more you have it, the better it gets, right? So to start that journey, the first thing you need to do is don't believe the hype. Question your stereotypes. Question what people say to you. If somebody offers you advice, is it advice or is it criticism? Second one is make a plan. Better, make 2 plans. Make one for when it works and one for when it doesn't work. And expect success from it. Make a plan that you're optimistic about. Plans should be realizable. They should be measurable. They should be specific, and everybody knows the rest of it. And then that'll promote you to take action. Because a plan without an action is just a wish. When you do that, you activate the reward centers in your brain. It reduces anxiety, it increases motivation, and more importantly, it means that you operate with a focus. So if you combine this focus with this expecting success and taking action, you're giving yourself the opportunity to win. So in any scenario, try and enact that. Make the plan, expect success, take action, get the chemicals working. And a more long-term view is simply to actively build your self-esteem, optimism, and happiness. But the good news is you only have to build 1 or 2 of them because they are interrelated. By making yourself more optimistic, you're likely to make yourself happier. By building your self-esteem, you're more likely to give yourself a perception of control. Giving yourself a perception of control is likely to mean that you're more optimistic. Being more optimistic means you're likely to be happier. Now, all of these contribute over time because confidence is cumulative to an increased level of confidence. This is from the book. Confidence is a belief, and beliefs can be changed. I'm hoping that 45 minutes ago you didn't believe that, but I'm kind of hoping that now you do. Thank you very much. Happy to take questions.